Welcome to Season 3 of the Climate Conscious Podcast. I'm your host, Deval Bazi, bringing awareness to climate change and sustainable development from a Caribbean perspective, connecting you to sustainability solutions as we move from awareness to action. Today's special guest holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Waterloo. He spent the first 5 years of his career in the water treatment and environmental remediation industry, developing new process technology. For 25 years, he has worked for Zeton Inc, the world's premier designer and builder of pilot plants for the chemical process industry. He is also an active advocate for the decarbonization of our economy and a transition to renewable and non-emitting energy sources to address the risk of global warming. I am delighted to welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast, Mr. Paul Martin.
Pleased to be here.
How are you today?
I'm doing well.
Nice. So climate change has been an issue for quite some time, and the call for action has been ongoing. The 2015 Paris Agreement set out clear targets for the world to cut emissions by 2030 and become net zero by 2050 in order to keep global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels. And net zero became a really big thing over the last 2 years or so, I would say. And since then, there has been major emphasis on decarbonization, as well as deep decarbonization across sectors. Paul, what do you think stirred this awakening that we are ruining the planet and things drastically need to change?
So I think we have to break it into two pieces. So first of all, I'm absolutely convinced that the science is very clear that global warming is a real risk, that we're causing it. I don't think that there's any credible scientific argument against that. And we engineers have to be really good at dealing with uncertainty. We don't need to calculate something down to the third decimal place in order to know how to mitigate it as a risk. So engineers are well prepared to understand this issue if their finances don't get in the way. And there's a famous quote that says that it's very hard for a person to understand something if their livelihood depends on them not understanding it. And I think that's actually half of our problem in the world right now. There's an awful lot of people who see their livelihoods as depending on not understanding that global warming is a real risk that needs to be mitigated. So the other piece of it is net zero. And I guess we can have a longer conversation about that. But net zero it's a nice idea, but really what we should be targeting is actual zero, as close to actual zero fossil greenhouse gas emissions as possible. The net business is a bit of a shaky thing. And technical people understand that, I think, with a varying degree of detail. Again, based on that quote that I just gave you, there are some people who are tying their lives up and their futures and their fortunes in trying to make net zero, the negative part of the net zero game, their business. And like I said, I think it's really important. We have to target actual zero fossil greenhouse gas emissions. That's going to be very hard. And it's still very necessary.
And I'm glad you brought up that interesting concept of net zero versus actual zero. And there's a lot of ambiguity around the concept of net zero. But what is your understanding of it?
Okay, so actual zero means stop burning fossils as fuels and dumping the CO2 to the atmosphere, and stop leaking methane to the atmosphere in the form of natural gas, etc. That's what we really need to do. We need to stop burning fossils. And what net zero is about, it's acknowledging that we have to actually emit some fossil CO2, maybe not from burning, but from some other things, and maybe even some from burning. And so if we're going to have emissions in one direction to be net zero, we have to have negative emissions in another direction. So we have to either not emit in the first place by capturing the CO2 and putting it somewhere durably away from the environment so it can't leak back in again, or we have to take CO2 that's in the atmosphere right now out of the atmosphere and store it away durably in some fashion. So part of that is legitimate and part of it is a scam. Let's just call a spade here. I feel it's very important to speak directly about these issues. So part of it is real and part of it's a scam. The scam part is pretending that we can take credit for what nature's already doing for us. Okay, nature's already figured out of this net zero business. Okay, nature's already doing all for us that it possibly can. And frankly, I find it rather difficult to swallow the notion that somebody that's preserving a forest should get carbon credits for doing so, is a logical thing to do. So a lot of this offsetting and carbon crediting that's done to kind of assuage people's consciences about their emissions, I find a lot of it to actually be a straight up scam and just not worth doing. The things themselves, as far as making sure that we don't do bad things with land use and so on, those are important, but they're the purview of government policy, and government should make good policy on these matters and should enforce it. But the part of this carbon negative thing that's actually durable or beneficial and reliable and not a scam, that's again a matter of opinion, and it depends who you talk to. Some of it is potential future stuff, like direct air capture, and some of it is stuff that we could start doing today if we really, felt strongly about actually mitigating, greenhouse gas emissions, which frankly I think we're still getting up the courage to do. So I'll give you one example of something that we can do to actually lock away CO2 that used to be in the atmosphere in a durable way that makes sense to me, and that's a very straightforward thing. So when let's say we have a agricultural waste material like sugarcane bagasse, the stems of the sugarcane that after the sugar's been pressed. Mm-hmm. That material, some of it you need for agriculture straight up, but some of it is a waste, and you could put that material to beneficial use by heating it up in the absence of oxygen. You would produce some fuel material that you could use. And you would produce some char that people refer to as biochar, because it's basically charcoal. It's material that came from that starting material and ends up as carbon with some of the mineral content of the plant matter locked up in it. And if you treat that material correctly, you can use it in agriculture, and it's a valuable soil amendment. So and it doesn't biodegrade anymore. So when you think about it in the big terms, there used to be CO2 in the atmosphere. The sugarcane plants absorbed it, turned it into valuable products. We then took the sugarcane bagasse and we turned part of it into fuel and part of it into carbon that we can put into the soil that's of benefit. And that carbon is now locked away from nature. Nature doesn't degrade it anymore. So that's what's called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. And I think it's a very good idea. And the reason I think that it's a very good idea is that there are some applications for energy that we all need that will rely on liquid fuels. We're best satisfied by liquid fuels because neither batteries nor hydrogen do a good job of those applications. And the perfect example is jet aircraft flying transoceanic distances. So for those applications, we're going to need liquid fuels. And if we can make those liquid fuels in such a way that the CO2 that's in them came from the atmosphere in the recent past, and as a part of making those fuels, we actually bury some carbon in the earth permanently, then that's actually a wonderful outcome. But the trouble with these things is they're very difficult to scale. So that first point that I made, I have to hammer it home again. The thing we have to do most urgently is to stop burning fossils as fuels to the extent that we possibly can, as quickly as we possibly can. And this negative carbon stuff, don't count on too much of it.
I think that the concept of net zero, it seems to give us a sense of the ability to continue doing what we have been doing. It
Right.
seems
And we
to
can't.
be right. It
We
seems to
can't.
be
Straight up can't.
yeah.
Life has to change. It doesn't have to be worse, but it has to change. The way I've put it many times is that we had a great party for the past 300 years. It was a great party on the energy that nature put away for us in the form of stored solar energy, in the form of these fossil materials. And we went through, in this party, we had a real blowout. We went through millions and millions of years worth of it. And, the result of this party was fantastic. It was a huge improvement in the quality of life for billions of people. And in fact, it allowed billions more people to live on the earth without starving to death. Like, let's not minimize it. This is a great party, but the party's over. Okay. So the alternative to the party isn't starving to death and having millions of people die. The alternative to the party is being smarter about where we get our energy from, how we make it, how we use it, and most importantly, what we do about the effluent from producing it. And the trouble is, we've known about this solidly for the past 30 years. But the end of good times is often people go into mourning, right? And two of the stages of mourning are denial and bargaining. And that's what we've been doing for the past 30 years. We've been denying that the problem's a problem. And then we've been bargaining with the problem, saying, well, this global warming, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe it won't happen quite so fast as some people think, or it won't be as bad as some people think. Maybe we don't have to, we can wait. Let's wait until there's better technology to solve the problem. And that denial and bargaining, it just delayed the implementation of solutions. And the trouble is that 30 years, that's been my whole career. For my whole career, we've known about this problem and we haven't done much about it, honestly. And that's criminally frustrating. It just drives me crazy for my kids and their kids.
Yes, and we're getting into a very controversial space. I know you advocate for a fossil-free future, but definitely the oil majors have a different idea.
And you should expect them to.
But coming back a bit, you mentioned BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And if you listen to episode 29 of this podcast, you'll hear about a Caribbean tech startup that will be producing green hydrogen using waste and solar energy, direct solar. And they can also produce biochar, as you mentioned.
Sure, but there's no need to make hydrogen. The trouble with hydrogen is that it's neither efficient nor effective as a fuel. So a lot of people make hydrogen because they think it's the flavor of the month at the moment. And there's a lot of confused thinking about hydrogen. We can talk about hydrogen in a lot of detail if you like. It's a passion of mine. I see it's very important for us to make green hydrogen, but only to replace black hydrogen.
I know you have a very polarizing view on hydrogen. And to quote you in one of your LinkedIn articles, you said, "I don't hate hydrogen. I think it's a dumb thing to use as a fuel or as a way to store electricity. That's all." And you call it hopium. So,
well, no, actually, hopium is a little, I have to kind of define that a little bit better.
Okay.
Because hydrogen is only, the whole hydrogen area or the hydrogen economy concept is rife with hopium, but hopium exists in the whole decarbonization space, and in fact in the whole technology development space. And basically what hopium is about is it's about the weaponization of people's hope to separate them from their money. It sounds like a drug, and that's what it is. It's a drug. You see, there are two problems out there in the world right now that are huge in relation to this issue. One of them is greenwashing, where people take an idea that isn't actually good for us and they tart it up in a way that makes it sound like it's good for us.
Oh, yes. A lot of that is happening. And also carbon washing.
The other one is called green wishing. Okay. And green wishing is when people hope that something will be a game changer. And they use that hope to kind of blind themselves to the problems of what they're proposing. And hopium is just, it's the vector by which we we get people to green wish about technologies. And hydrogen is just one example of a technology where hopium dealing by interested parties is rife. And it's inarguably true. I mean, if you look in Europe, it's just the worst. But it's happening in Canada. It's happening in the United States. It's happening all over the world. Oh my goodness, it's going crazy in Australia as well. So yeah, it's not really, hydrogen's not, the whole hydrogen economy thing is rife with hopium. There's all kinds of people taking the kernel of a good idea and turning it into popcorn with hyperbole and using that to market things well beyond their applicability. But that happens with all sorts of things like electric vehicles, which I think are fabulous technology, really the best thing. We should be going after them very aggressively. There's lots of hopium peddlers in the electric vehicle space too, so it's not just hydrogen.
Contrary to your position, as you kind of alluded to, there's a lot of activity globally around the hydrogen economy with policy developers, researchers, and industry. Mm-hmm. So it may seem like you are the lone voice crying out against this development.
And you see, I have the zeal of a recovered addict, because I was involved in the last round, not the last round, but the last really energetic round of hopium dealing in relation to hydrogen as a participant. I was working I had customers that were major oil companies that were working on hydrogen as first a way to fuel vehicles, and then later it was going to be used for combined heat and power in homes. And my company was working, helping them develop this technology. And the story I always tell people is that we a large number of engineers, myself and a bunch of other people for the client company, and we'd be working earnestly all day trying to develop this technology. And then we'd go out for dinner and drinks in the evening in Houston. And after a few beers, inevitably somebody would turn to the crowd and say, "So you realize this is all rubbish, right?" Like, "Oh yeah, absolute stinking rubbish." Like the thermodynamics just don't add up. But boy, we're working on it earnestly because the interests of the company are aligned with doing so. And that's basically what's going on. So a lot of this stuff that's out there it consists of, the way I've characterized it very rudely, is that it's really the fossil fuel lobby and their useful idiots. So as far as the fossil fuel industry is concerned, hydrogen's a win-win bet. And Michael Liebreich put this absolutely accurately, in my view. He's the founder of Bloomberg NEF. And what he said is, for the fossil fuel industry, hydrogen is a win-win. You just can't lose. So either hydrogen turns into nothing, but it delays actual decarbonization by electrifying everything, which is something I believe in firmly. And if it delays that inevitability and the fossil fuel companies don't sell electricity, then the fossil fuel companies win, at least in the short term. And if instead the hydrogen hyperbole epidemic pushes or pulls government money into pulling the fossil fuel industry into a decarbonized future in the role of supplying energy to it, then the fossil fuel companies win. So what's not to like? If you're Shell, what's not to like about hydrogen? It's fantastic. But the really nefarious thing is that, honestly, what's really going on is that these guys want to demonstrate to their investors, not demonstrate, but I guess pretend to their investors would be a better way to put it, that their natural gas assets in the ground have value in a decarbonized future, when in fact they probably don't. Or if they have value, it's greatly diminished from the value that people currently think that it has.
I think that is exactly the challenge that we're dealing with right now. On one hand, we have persons like yourself who are focused on a fossil-free future. And on the other hand, persons in the petroleum sector are envisioning a totally different future.
Mm-hmm. I hold with what Mendeleev said. Mendeleev is the father of the periodic table, and clearly a man who knew a lot about chemistry. And Mendeleev said something that I really think is absolutely true. What he said is that burning petroleum is basically like burning banknotes in the kitchen stove to keep warm. It's not a sensible thing to do. The reason that we've done it, and we've done it in this profligate way for the past 100 years in particular, is that it's cheap enough and it's so effective. I mean, my goodness, it just facilitates all sorts of great things that we really value. But the thing that underpinned that use of petroleum as a fuel was the atmosphere. And we ran out of atmospheric carrying capacity. So it's over. And, there are lots of people whose vested interest will come to an end. And that reality has to sink in. But let's be clear. That's not the only thing we use petroleum for, and that's what Mendeleev was on about. Mendeleev was saying that petroleum is too valuable to burn, and I totally agree with that. If we look at it from a 7 generations perspective, like the First Nations people in Canada are supposed to think about things, looking at burning petroleum is just nuts, because its highest value use to humankind is not burning it, but rather making these tens of thousands of molecules and materials that we depend on for our modern lives every bit as much as we depend on energy, and yet which, for reasons of the most basic chemistry, are far, far harder to make from biomass than they are to make from these fossil resources. So if we were thinking 7 generations ahead, we wouldn't have been burning petroleum even before we knew that global warming was a thing, but of course we don't think 7 generations. We can barely think 1 generation. There's a lot of people who have the means to save for their own retirement, and yet they can't defer their own gratification long enough to save for their own retirement, much less worrying about future generations and their access to resources. So, this is the thing. I don't think the fossil fuel industry is going to end. Okay. Sorry, my apologies. The fossil fuel industry is going to end, or we're in deep trouble with the climate. But the fossil petroleum industry isn't going to end. It's simply going to shrink to become the chemicals and materials business. And we can do that without a single new invention. We don't have to invent anything new to make plastics and chemicals without dumping CO2 into the atmosphere. All we have to do is put a value on dumping fossil CO2 and methane to the atmosphere so that it's worth avoiding. And we can deploy existing technology without a single new invention to make that a possibility. Now, those businesses will still be some of the very biggest businesses on Earth and some of the most profitable. They just won't be selling stuff for burning it anymore. That's the thing. It's not an end to the petroleum industry. It really isn't. It's a dramatic reduction in its scale and scope.
It's a paradigm shift.
Yeah, for the benefit of humankind, though. It's famously said that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones.
So what I get from you is that the issue is not producing the production of petroleum, it's the burning of it.
Mm-hmm. That's what fossil fuel use means. Okay, now natural gas, the uses for natural gas, other than burning it, are pretty minimal unless you do hydrogen. And this is the trouble. The petroleum industry understands that you can make hydrogen from natural gas. And in fact, that's how we make most of the hydrogen in the world right now. In fact, 98.7% of the hydrogen in the world right now is made from either natural gas or petroleum or coal without carbon capture. Okay, that's how we make it. We make 120 million tons of it a year.
And that's black hydrogen.
Yeah, that's what I call black hydrogen, what the industry calls either gray or brown hydrogen. But that's just a euphemism. Let's be real. It's 30% blacker, barest minimum, than per joule, per unit of energy, than if you just burned those fossil materials for energy in the first place. Okay. So the reality of hydrogen right now is we don't use it as a fuel because using it as a fuel would be dumb. Using it as a fuel would just be a waste of energy relative to just burning the fuel we started with instead. So that's what we do. When we need heat, we don't burn hydrogen, we burn natural gas. So really what's going on with the petroleum industry is that they're trying to sell you on the notion that they're going to make hydrogen the way we do now, except they're going to capture the CO2 instead of venting it. And then they're going to permanently bury it somewhere. And that idea, it's technically possible, but the devil is in the details in these sorts of things. And in fact, there's a paper that was released, including a New York Times summary of that paper yesterday by two guys named Bob Howarth and Mark Jacobson, both academics out of the United States. And they actually look at the details of making hydrogen with carbon capture, which is what people are calling blue hydrogen. And the deal with that is pretty straightforward. First of all, when you start with natural gas, there's some natural gas leakage associated with producing natural gas. And the industry really downplays the estimates of leakage, but the satellite measurements are showing something quite different, showing that the methane leakage is actually quite a substantial amount. And then the other part of it is that when you have to capture this CO2 that you make when you make hydrogen, some of the CO2, about half of it, is easy to capture because it comes out under pressure in the hydrogen production gas purification train. And half of it is hard to capture because it comes out of a furnace. It's flue gas, just like CO2 coming out of a power plant. And so that's hard to capture. And by hard, I mean it takes a lot of energy to capture it. And when you produce that energy by burning even more natural gas, just the leakage and the emissions from making that extra energy in order to do the capture basically make it no better to burn blue hydrogen than if you just burn natural gas. And that's true even when you use quite conservative estimates of how much methane leakage there is in the production of natural gas. So that paper is really solid. I spent few hours yesterday reading it line by line and then back checking calculations and so on, because I found the results really quite surprising. I figured that blue hydrogen would be better than black hydrogen, and as it turns out, it's if it's better at all, it's only marginally better, and only if you think in the very long term as opposed to the relevant 20-year time horizon that we're really talking about. And we'd be far better off to just skip the whole thing and work on electrifying everything. That just makes way, way more sense than trying to capture CO2 by making hydrogen as a vector for using fossil fuels in the future without making CO2 emissions. Because frankly, it just doesn't look like it works very well. It's not very effective as a decarbonization strategy. Whether it makes money or not is another issue too, but it's not an effective decarbonization strategy, so we shouldn't do it. And we especially shouldn't use government money to do it, which is the only way it's getting done right now.
So what about the quote-unquote sectors that are hard to
decarbonize?
Or hard to electrify?
Yeah, absolutely. This is always the crutch. It's like, oh yeah, well, we need hydrogen for the hard to decarbonize sectors. Well, you know what? If there's hard to decarbonize sectors and easy to decarbonize sectors, and we're worried about climate change, we should be focusing on decarbonizing the easy to decarbonize sectors, because we can do that for less cost and less impact to people's lives per ton of CO2 that we save. That's just logic. That's just the most basic logic. So this hard to decarbonize sector business, half of it is forcing hydrogen into applications where it really doesn't work very well. It's neither efficient nor effective. So what they're doing is they're saying, okay, well, yeah, we will reluctantly agree that we can electrify cars and light trucks, and hydrogen is probably not a good fit there. I mean, that's an understatement. Hydrogen is a terrible fit for cars and light trucks, and it's deader than a doornail for that application. But let's look at, say, jet aircraft. Well, we probably can't electrify them. That's true. So therefore, hydrogen. Well, sorry, but hydrogen is not a good fit for jet aircraft either, because jet aircraft have to push their fuel through the air at high speed against drag. And so how big the fuel is, its energy density per unit volume, matters considerably. It matters as much as the energy density per unit mass does. Okay, so hydrogen's energy density per unit mass is really good. Its energy density per unit volume is terrible. And that makes it infeasible as a jet aircraft fuel. And, who's working on hydrogen for jet aircraft? Companies that get paid largely in subsidy from governments like Airbus. And even Airbus says, yeah, it's not really going to happen in any scale before 2050. Yeah, I think it's not going to happen in any scale ever. But yeah, it's a lot of those hard to decarbonize sectors. They're just like, well, okay, electrification is hard, therefore hydrogen. Well, no, that's a non sequitur. It's jumping to conclusions. There are other ways to accomplish most of the things that people are tasking hydrogen with. And every use of hydrogen as either a fuel or, for transport or for heating, it's likely better satisfied by something else. So either electrification with or without batteries, or by biofuels. And if you do the biofuels with BECCS, as I mentioned, you actually get that carbon negative portion that we need in order to compensate for things like cement making, where we are actually roasting fossil rocks and releasing the CO2 from them. So we're going to need to do some negative capture in order to be able to keep making cement and using it. So yeah, a lot of things. This Michael Liebreich, again, he made this very interesting graphic that he calls the hydrogen ladder. It's kind of a ladder of uses, with the best uses for hydrogen, or green hydrogen in particular, at the top of the ladder and the terrible ones at the bottom. And what I did is I took his ladder and I highlighted the various uses that he was thinking that hydrogen might be put to, with what I think would be a good alternative. And what's left, the places where hydrogen actually fits as a decarbonization strategy, they're pretty small. I mean, okay, they may be significant parts of our economy, like steel making, as an example. It's not actually steel making, it's reducing iron ore to iron. That's a place where hydrogen as a chemical reagent, not a fuel, might make sense. Okay, but there's a handful of them. It's not very many. So the hard to decarbonize sectors, there's not much to them. Most of the so-called hard to decarbonize sectors are just things that we can do with electrification or with biofuels, and that'll cost more money. But trying to do them with hydrogen would be even harder and would cost even more money. So it's not a good idea. And again, I'm asserting these things as if like I know everything, and I don't claim to know everything. But readers or people that are listening are encouraged to read my articles on LinkedIn. I use LinkedIn as a platform deliberately because it allows me to go back and edit my articles as I learn new things and as things change. So they're not like a stake driven in the sand that people will stumble over in the future when something I said 10 years ago is no longer applicable. So I encourage people to go there and read my articles, because I actually develop my positions there in detail with references. So you can take my word for it for now that I'm not speaking off the top of my head. I'm speaking from a position of making and using the gas for 30 years and understanding these issues at a fairly profound level.
Yes, and I'll definitely place the link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes, so listeners can have easy access to you.
Exactly. And I encourage readers of those articles to engage me where they think I've gone wrong and provide me with references that demonstrate where I've gone wrong. And then if I read them and I say, hey, you know what, I have gone wrong, which has happened many times in the past, by the way, I'll change my opinion to match the facts, and I'll edit the articles to match. So, I have great followers who are really, really smart people, who know more about some industries than, they've forgotten more about some industries than I'll ever know. And they provide just tremendous feedback and insight. And I feed that into my articles.
So, Paul, you are a reformed or a recovered
hopium addict.
Hopium.
Yes. I used to think hydrogen was the best thing, the greatest thing since sliced bread. It was only through learning that I realized what its limitations were, and that they weren't, little stumbling blocks that we could invent our way around. That they were actually like hydrogen's kind of a square wheel. You can't make it better except by turning it into a round one, which means it's not hydrogen anymore.
And you're placing all your money on electrification and biofuels for our fossil-free future.
Well, it's actually a little bit more than that. So if you read, I have a nice article. It's actually one of my least read energy articles, which is a little disappointing, but because I think it's one of my best articles. And it's called "What are the Energy Solutions?" And the number one energy solution is, if you care about decarbonization, you have to make dumping fossil CO2 and methane to the atmosphere cost money. And if it doesn't cost money, we won't decarbonize the economy, period. So the very first thing you have to do is you have to make dumping CO2 to the atmosphere cost money. And if you do that, one of the big solutions to decarbonization is just going to be not doing a bunch of stuff anymore. So not wasting energy to do dumb things. I'll give you a perfect example. For about a decade, I was working 1 day a week at home for my employer. And there were old fuddy-duddies that worked there that didn't like that because they wanted people to be, they thought that people could only really work if they were sitting at a desk in the office. And I worked at home because my drive was terrible, but also because I could concentrate better at home. There were fewer distractions. But I did that, like I said, against the objections of certain people in my employer. And then all of a sudden, what happened in March of 2020? All of a sudden, working at home went from being something that the company didn't like to being something that the company mandated. And my drive to work and back, which used to be 61 kilometers each way, dropped to nothing. I've been in the office twice in the past 18 months or whatever, 17, 16 months. And what I'm doing now is I'm moving information back and forth instead of moving me back and forth. And it's not perfect, but working in the office isn't perfect either. Nothing's perfect. It's certainly a reasonable accommodation. And not only is it saving all those greenhouse gas emissions from me driving my car and all of the toxic emissions out of the tailpipe of the car, but it's also saving me 7.5 hours a week in which I no longer have to fight the miserable traffic in Toronto. 7.5 hours per week that I wasn't being paid for. So that's a huge improvement in my life that arose because of COVID, which I would gladly trade that sacrifice against all the lives that have been lost and the suffering that's happened. In a heartbeat, I would do that. But life sometimes gives you pluses and minuses. And with COVID, one of the pluses has been that we realize that a lot of us can work from home. And so what carbon taxes will do is they will put a real cost in dollars and cents on a lot of the things that we do right now, just because we've always been doing them. And so emission reductions as a result of consumption reduction will be a huge part of it. But where we have to actually do things, we just have to do them more efficiently. So if we need a benefit of, say, moving me to my office, we can provide that much better if I were to take the train than driving even my electric car. And of course, if we can put more people in each of those cars, that would be great too. And if we can do more walking and active transport in addition to the public transport, we'll actually have a healthier population too. So it's kind of not the right way to think of the problem as, well, okay, we're burning stuff right now. What else do we burn? Or how do we make the same number of joules of energy? That's really the wrong way to think about it. The way to think about it is, let's stop putting stuff into the atmosphere because it's bad. It's going to screw up the world for future generations. Let's stop doing that. And if we know that doing that is going to be expensive for future generations, let's prohibit it now by making it expensive. And if you do that, the market, which, it's not infallible for sure, it needs the help of government to regulate and tax in the public interest. But the market will allocate capital to the solutions that actually make sense. And if green hydrogen is one of those solutions, oh my goodness, I'll be delighted. I'll love to see that. I don't think it is as a fuel, that's for sure. Either for heating or transport. But if green hydrogen is a solution to reducing iron ore, or it's a solution to making ammonia so that we can keep eating, and I love to eat, and we're dependent on ammonia for fertilizing crops so that we can eat, then, green hydrogen is the best thing since sliced bread. Bring it on. It's way better than the black stuff that we're using now.
Interesting perspective, Paul. It's not really about substitution, but it's more about transformation of our economies to really embrace that, some would say utopian idea of a fossil fuel future, a fossil-free future.
I really hope it's not utopian, because if it is utopian, we're in deep trouble. I don't see a fossil-free future as utopian at all. I see it as not only necessary, but practical. Okay, and that's as a chemical engineer. I'm not one prone to fantasy, and I am not an idealist at all. I'm not an idealist. I am very, very solidly a pragmatic realist. And a transition away from burning fossils is not only possible, it's practical. And especially, we think about this party that we were having, and there was an admission to be paid. And the admission to be paid to the fossil fuel party was giving over a huge fraction of our treasure, and in fact, the lives of soldiers and the like too, to the people that won the geological lottery by having oil and gas and coal under their particular patch of dirt. Okay. And it's not exactly an egalitarian or fair thing. Now, it's the reality of the world. Resources are found on the earth where they're found, and they belong to the people who live there. And that's fine, fair enough. But, one of the things that I see, and again, thinking about the Caribbean region in particular, right now, I just read that electricity generation in the Caribbean is 85% dependent on imported fossil fuels. Now, it may be imported from other, Trinidad, for instance, is a big supplier, but that's not everywhere. That region of the world is, it's not the tier one access to renewable energy, but it's also not a mostly heating climate like Canada is, where we have a big problem called not wanting to freeze to death in winter that is overwhelming. So, solar energy in Canada is, the availability on a capacity factor basis is only 16% at best. It's terrible. And still, solar is a great thing in Canada when it's used appropriately. My farm is powered by solar because it's cheaper than bringing in wires from the local grid for the number of kilowatt hours that I need. So I have solar and batteries, and it works great. So what I see is that renewable energy, if it's done right, it actually democratizes energy in a tremendous way, meaning that it puts that production in the hands of the people who are either, us or our neighbors, our neighbors and friends. My place, for instance, I'm lucky enough to own a house, and I have solar panels on the roof, even though the grid here in Ontario makes solar panels on the roof kind of needless. There's no decarbonization benefit to doing so. I have solar panels on my roof because it allows me to do things like charge my electric car from the sun and not pay the grid for that power. Again, I see renewables as being, and renewables for the developing world, like for Africa, oh my goodness. When you're talking about people who have no access to electricity or intermittent access to very expensive electricity, giving them the opportunity to have solar powered lighting, to extend their day. It's just tremendously liberating and valuable if it's done right. So I really hope we do these things right. And I think that the global warming mitigation can be one of the ways that we do that right.
Well, we really need to. We don't have much of a choice, especially
we don't,
here.
Yeah.
In our region.
Life's easy when you have no choice. A good friend of mine said that about his diabetes. He has to eat in a very regular way. Otherwise, his life is in danger. And I said, isn't that difficult? He said, no, life's easy when you have no choice.
Yes. And the recent IPCC report, emphasizes the need for urgent action. Not that we didn't know all along.
Now, I have to tell you a little amusing story. And that is from 30 years ago. So 30 years ago, I was a young chemical engineering master's student at the University of Waterloo. And a professor decided to hold a seminar of the department. So about half of the professors came and most of the grad students came. And the purpose of the seminar was to brainstorm, what are we going to do with CO2? Because CO2 is so clearly a problem now. Okay, so in 1991, 1989, in fact, 1987, we were really solidly, it was very clear that CO2 had to be dealt with. So in 91, we're sitting there and we're kind of, stodgy chemical engineers kind of coming around to the idea that maybe CO2 was something we had to deal with. And so what would happen is people would throw out an idea and they'd say, well, we could do this with it. And then someone else would come along and say, yeah, but thermodynamics, right? And they give some thermodynamic explanation for why that idea really wasn't a good idea. And so one by one, the ideas would come up and, it was like a clay pigeon would go up with an idea and the shotgun of thermodynamics would shoot it down. And eventually the professor that was running the seminar got really upset. And he said, look, this is a brainstorming session. We're supposed to be generating ideas, not shooting them down. So let's just lay thermodynamics aside for a minute And my brilliant friend, Landon Steele, who I'm still friends with all these years later, she said, well, then, if we're not going to talk about thermodynamics, we'll just make diamonds and oxygen from the CO2, and we'll go to the grad club and raise a glass to solving the problem. The whole thing is about thermodynamics. The reason that we're making CO2 as a product of energy producing reactions like burning stuff is that CO2 is what's called a low Gibbs free energy product. So that means it has a very low amount of chemical potential energy. In fact, it doesn't really have any chemical potential energy left in it. So the very process by which we're making this energy is a result of making CO2. And the trouble with thermodynamics is that it's true in reverse as well. So if you want to start with CO2 and make anything of value, you have to put in a giant amount of energy. And it's just the other side of the same coin. And nature does that. All plants, that's how all life on Earth works, is that plants use sunlight and CO2 and water, and they make carbohydrates, and that feeds us all. But nature does that because it has no choice. It's very, very hard. And after 1 billion years of evolution, nature's only got the efficiency of that process to 2% at best. So 2% of the energy from the sun that falls on the leaves of the plant end up as energy stored in carbohydrates in the plant. And that's after 1 billion years of evolution. So, we humans, we can already do better than that, which is pretty impressive, but it's still fraught because we're starting, it's like we've thrown Humpty Dumpty down off the wall to make energy. And now we're trying to glue him back together again and put him back up there. It's just, it's not the smartest thing. So some of these strategies that are talking about a circular carbon economy, where we take CO2 out of the atmosphere and we use hydrogen, electricity to make hydrogen from water, and then we react the CO2 with the hydrogen to make fuels, the so-called e-fuels. That process is fundamentally fraught. It's hard to make sense of it, and it's very, very difficult for me to imagine that it'll ever make money.
So, Paul, given all that we've discussed, the net zero scam, as you call it, versus
unfortunately,
your actual zero ambition, denial and bargaining, and green wishing. When do you think the global community would be saying RIP to fossil fuels?
Good question. That's a very good question. And you're asking me to be clairvoyant. If you asked my young self in 1991, I figured we'd be done it by now. And we've barely started. I mean, if you look at the CO2 emissions of the economies of the world, they're still climbing. They're still going up. We haven't even stopped the rise yet. So honestly, as I said, I'm a pragmatic realist. I'm not an optimist, but I do believe that the German author Goethe said that in all things, hope is preferable to despair. And I would just put parentheses behind that and say, as long as the hope doesn't, in order for you to have your particular bit of hope, that doesn't mean that you have to violate laws of the universe, then hope is preferable to despair. That's true. And there's really nothing in thermodynamics that stops us from solving the global warming problem. It's possible for us to do. The trouble is that it's a hearts and minds thing. It's a values thing. And we engineers, we're just terrible at solving problems like that. We're not good. I try to be a good communicator, but honestly, I think as a discipline, engineers are not known for their strong communication skills. And it's really what we need to do is we need to communicate to the people that we need to address this problem by addressing the underlying economics with carbon taxes and addressing the emissions that are hard to tax out of existence with bans, with regulation. And those legitimate tools of government, taxation and regulation, must be in place before there's any solution. So if you want to know what the future is going to look like, you have to know kind of what the present looks like. And right now, in terms of carbon tax, which is the minimally necessary first step, it's happening in Europe, which is wonderful to see. And even more importantly, Europe is thinking about putting a carbon tariff on the goods and services of nations who are cheaters or laggards who don't actually put carbon taxes in place. And so instead of everybody being at the penguins at the edge of the ice floe and being afraid to be the first ones to put the carbon tax in place because everybody else that stays behind will get an advantage, Europe is saying, look, we're doing it. And if you don't do it, we're going to tax your goods and services to make sure that they're not cheaper than ours. And Canada's going to do the same thing. In fact, unless our government changes in the fall, which it might, we're headed to $170 a ton carbon tax by 2030. And this is broadly supported by the Canadian public because of the clever way that it's been done. Okay. It's not a dumb tax that just dumps money into government revenue and they get addicted to it and they waste it on stupid things. It's being done very cleverly, and the Canadian public supports it as necessary. So that's pretty wonderful. But the trouble is the United States. They're the trouble. Even Biden is not really a pro-carbon tax guy. And so if the United States doesn't do it, until the United States has done it, it's really hard to imagine it'll happen ever. And so I think, honestly, we're stuck into 2 degrees C climate, global temperature rise, whether we like it or not. Because even if we got our, collective hind ends in gear on this issue really earnestly, in the next 5 years, it will take decades to make it happen. And by the time we've done that, 2 degrees C for sure will be locked in, and maybe more. So, I guess I'm optimistic that it's possible, or not optimistic, but hopeful that it's possible. I see reason for hope that it's possible, but I'm not so hopeful that it'll happen in the immediate future. And I the thing that will make me dance with joy is when the United States actually has a national carbon pricing strategy in place. Until then, forget about China, forget about India, forget about other major emitters in the world. They're just going to talk about it and not do anything about it because the Americans have to take the lead. They're rich, they should, and they don't, they won't. So that's the trouble. Let's hope that changes.
Hope, not hopium.
Yeah, exactly. Hope that doesn't involve, turning your brain off. It doesn't involve being drugged.
Well, I have to thank you so much for your pragmatic, realist perspective of our sustainable future.
Well, I hope it was of some use to your listeners. And again, I refer them to my articles because you should never, my sister gives a wonderful piece of advice. And that is that, you should try to keep your mind open, but not so open that your brain falls out of your head. So, this guy is talking and maybe he's convincing, but we should really see if he knows what he's talking about and see if he's got the references to back it up. And if you read my articles, you'll find that I do. Yes. And if I don't, fix it. I'm happy to learn.
You welcome any challenges.
I do.
Great.
It was a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you for listening to the Climate Conscious Podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe and connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter @The Climate Conscious. And be sure to check out the Climate Conscious Lifestyle Kit.